Hi everyone, my name is Mads, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my 2023 Reading Wrapped. I'm not going to do a long intro for this video because it's pretty self-explanatory, but basically I'm going to be telling you all about my 2023 reading as a whole. So there's two main categories to this. Firstly, we're going to go through some stats, just what did I read, how much did I read, how did I rate it, etc, etc. I have a lot of information. And then we're going to get into my kind of favourite books of the year. I will put chapters down below of where those two sections split up, so you can skip to one or the other if it's more of interest to you. But I'm going to try and put them all in one video because otherwise this video is going to be coming out in February. And we just want to get it out whilst it's still relatively near the new year. So we're going to start off with statistics. I have pages of information, so I will be looking down a bit, but I'll do my best. In terms of where I get all this information from, I use an adapted version of G from Book Roast's Core Pile tracker. I don't personally rate my books using Core Pile because I've tried it in the past and it's a really cool rating system and I occasionally use it, but I will put all my numbers in and it will spit out a star rating and my brain will go, nope, that's not right. So then end up editing the numbers back and forth until it hits the star rating I want it to be on. So like, it just doesn't quite work for me. I rate on vibes more than anything else. But every so often when I really just don't know how to rate a book, I will use those numbers to give me an indication and see if it feels right. But I've edited the spreadsheet over the years to something that's more suited to me. Actually, my biggest round of edits have been going into 2024. So next year you'll see a completely different version. But this year it's very much based on G's Core Pile. I'll link down below where G talks about the tracker that she makes. That is what I use to track all of my reading, so that is where the majority of these statistics have come from. So, overall, how much did I read in 2023? I read 125 books, which comes out at about a book every 3 days, which feels about right for how I was reading throughout the year, and a total number of pages of 37,502, which works out as about 102 pages a day, which I'm so chuffed with. I do not make page goals for myself, absolutely not. I do not read consistently enough for that. I will genuinely fluctuate between not reading for a week or reading 10 pages a day to reading a 300-page book in a day and doing that 2 days in a row. Like, it's big waves. So making a consistent page number goal wouldn't work for me, but I always consider like a really good reading day is when I've read over 100 pages, and doesn't matter if I've read less than that, I don't care, but like that's what I'm like, I've read today, like I've sat down and I've committed to it. So knowing that that's how I've averaged out throughout the year is pretty cool. So that makes me quite happy. My biggest reading month, I'm not going to say best because I've not looked at star rating spread throughout the year, but my biggest reading month was in August, where I read 16 books and 5,285 pages, which was a lot. I don't quite know how I did it. I think that was the month I may have had like a weekend readathon potentially that started me off strong, and then I also read a few manga. But my smallest was December, where I read 4 books and only 1,409 pages. I had a lot going on in December. I was moving, I was working out a lot of life stuff, and honestly, I just kind of lost my mojo for reading, and that's fine. I'm working on getting it back at the moment, and I read a bit slower now than I think I have done for the past year, and I'm prioritizing other things in my life, and that's great. In terms of the average length of book I read, I find this really interesting personally because to me, I read a lot of books in the 300 to 400 page kind of bracket, and I wanted to see if that was true. And so interestingly, my 3 most read lengths are 150 to 200 pages, where I read 21 books, 350 to 400 pages, where I read 19 books, and then 200 to 250, which is 18 books. And that is and isn't surprising to me because I, this year, mentioned before, have got really into manga. Manga is often 150 to 250 pages, so reading a lot of books in that range makes total sense. It's not all manga, I also read novellas and shorter books, but a lot of that will be manga. So that actually makes a lot of sense. And then longer ones totally make sense. I've read very few super long books. I think my longest was probably Prior of the Orange Tree reread at like 800 plus. And I imagine my shortest was some like ebook novella I read in the middle of a series, which was probably like 30 pages mini story. I think one of the Green Creek TJ Klune books was probably that. That makes sense to me. I also have read a lot more literary fiction this year, which quite often comes in much smaller books. Variety of things, but a lot of manga. I think is the biggest reason for those categories being so large. And on that, how much of different types of books have I read this year? So I have read 76 novels, which works out as around 61% of my reading. That makes sense, it's the majority of what I read. I then have read 30 manga, which is 24% of my reading, which also makes sense, but just seems a bit wild because I think last year it probably would have been 0. So that's it's a big new thing entering the arena. I've then read 12 novellas, which works out as almost 10% of my reading, and 5 graphic novels at 4%, and 1 book of essays at 0.8%. So vast majority books, manga, novellas. That is in no way, shape or form surprising to me. That is exactly what I would expect and will probably remain relatively similar for coming years. I will also say for all of the rest of the statistics, I will be having everything all in one, so genre, this and that, it covers all of those categories. And I'll just make a note that this year I am tracking, to an extent, manga and novels separately, just because to me they are very different sources of taking in stories, and it doesn't really track in my head to track them together, especially when you come to like genre. I want to know, am I reading contemporary novels and fantasy manga, or am I reading contemporary manga and fantasy novels? Like it's interesting to me, so I'm going to be tracking them more separately in the future, but I have not done for this year, so everything's very collated. Another thing in terms of how I was reading was how did I consume these books, and I read 111 books physically and 14 on ebook, which makes total sense to me. I didn't read, I don't think, a single audiobook. Well, I suppose I did. I listened to the Elliot Page memoir, but I also read along with it, so that's probably in there somewhere. But I don't really do audiobooks. I'm trying to get into them slightly more this year, but we'll see how it goes. And I personally have a really strong preference for reading physically versus on ebook. I actually read more ebooks this year than I realised, mainly because there was a few novellas which are only available on ebook, and then also, given I now commute in London quite a lot, time spent on the tube, I try where I can, if I'm doing more than 20 minutes on the tube, to read a bit. And I've had a few months where I did that quite a lot. But again, if I've read a mixture of physical and ebook, I wouldn't be surprised if I've put that down as physical, because that's how it feels like primarily to me. It's a personal preference thing. I'm not a big e-reader. I like holding a book. Always have done, most likely always will do. Next up, genre. So this is kind of surprising, but not really. So my top read genre is contemporary. Within that, I would have included a lot of lit fic, is basically how I've done it. I think, again, 2024, I've added literary fiction as a category, because contemporary can be anything from like teen YA story in high school through to like really deep literary fiction, and to me that doesn't quite cover it. But for this year, contemporary, 44 books at 35% of my reading. And then next up was fantasy, 29 books at 23% of my reading, which is actually higher than I would have expected, because I only really got back into fantasy within this last year, so more of that than I expected, which is cool. Third was romance at 24 books with 19% of my reading. Totally makes sense. I love romance. I've got really into it in the last couple of years and have been reading some really good romance series, which has definitely helped me read more. My fourth most read genre with 9 books is what I refer to as speculative, and this is very much a genre I've added to this tracker, and one that isn't probably an official genre in any way, shape or form. You'll actually see this more in my favourites in a minute, but to me it's a book that has very slight fantastical elements or like a magical feel, but is very much the story it's telling, and the setting is like a contemporary story. It's about the people, and some of these could definitely be classed as fantasy, but to me that just doesn't feel right if the story it's trying to tell isn't a fantasy. So I kind of do this on vibes, but I do put some books in the speculative category when that feels best for me, and as I said, as you'll see, a lot of my favourite books fall into that kind of a category. And then I read 5 sci-fi books, which is 4% of my reading, and then I'll just run through the rest because we get to very small numbers very quickly. I read 4 thrillers, 3 horrors, 3 dystopian, 2 historical and 2 non-fiction. Only surprise there, 3 horror. This is entirely because it's books that I would never have thought were horror, and then you look them up and they're classed as horror, and I'm like, you know what, we'll claim it. I'm a scaredy cat. I don't like me any horror. I don't like scary things, but apparently some of the things I read are classed as like borderline horror. So I'm learning there's different categories of horror where things are horrific versus things are scary. Scary? Keep it so far away from me. Horrific? I can vibe with. So next up, the all-important, what did I think of the books I read? How did I rate them? So I will just say, if anyone bothered to do the maths, there will be lower numbers of books in this than the rest of all my other statistics, and that's because I don't rate non-fiction. Generally, I will give a review of it, but I don't tend to rate it, and I don't rate manga, very simply because I can tell you as a whole, like, is a series a 5-star series for me, but I really struggle to rate the individual volumes. I will sometimes be able to do a like, I know I particularly like this volume or particularly didn't enjoy this one, but personally there is so little story in each one and they take me so little time to read that my brain just kind of can't formulate a rating, and what I was ending up doing was just rating all of them 4 stars, which felt a little bit redundant, or if it's a series I love, rating all of them 5 stars. So you may occasionally see a rating on Goodreads, but for my own personal tracking, I don't rate manga, basically. And then I also don't rate some of the novellas that I've read for parts of series, again, if they're like 100-page equivalent online text, I just don't rate them. I know how I feel about the series as a whole. But with all that out of the way, what did I rate the books that I did rate? So I had 31 5-star reads in 2023, which was 35% of my reading, which seems really good, and is, but 10 of those were rereads. So I only had 21 new 5-star reads, which is still really good, but is a bit more balanced. I then had 35 4-star reads at almost 40% of my reading. I had 18 3-star reads at around 20%, and then I had 5 2-star reads at about 6%. No 1-stars. I don't think I'd ever make it to the end of a 1-star book, to be honest. I think that's very unlikely. I'm surprised by how many 2-stars there are, but I have had some belters of not great books this year. And then the 3, 4, 5 seems about right. I am on an endless journey to be comfortable rating a book 3 stars, but at the same time, I am pretty good at picking books I'll like. Like, I know my reading tastes decently well, and I'm not going to get it on the head every single time, but I also don't read things I don't think I'm going to enjoy to an extent. Like sometimes I'll be like, I'm just intrigued by this book, so I'm going to give it a go. But 99% of the time I'm picking up a book because I think I'm going to really enjoy it or find it interesting. So I would expect a lot of 4 and 5-star reads. So about tracks that in terms of new, I had relatively equal 3 stars and 5 stars and then more 4 stars. It seems about right for me, but I'm aware it's higher than a lot of people, and that's fine. With the mention of rereads, I thought I'd say I had 16 rereads this year, which is about 13% of my reading, and 109 were new reads at 87%. Again, that seems quite good. I think rereads is actually quite high on that, and I know it's going to get higher again this year. I have reached the critical point where I have been reading pretty consistently for 5 or 6 years now, which is bonkers to me. I still feel like it's new. But therefore, I'm getting to the point where the books I read in my first year or 2 of reading, it's been long enough, I'm like, oh, I don't really remember it, I want to give it another go. And so I am picking up more and more rereads. I also am getting into the middle of some series, and when I'm reading series, I often like rereading previous books whilst I go on to the next one. So, for example, this year I read Icebreaker in spring, and then when Wildfire came out at the end of summer, I read Icebreaker again to read Wildfire. Exactly the same with Fourth Wing. Read it in spring, read it again when Iron Flame came out. So I do have some within year rereads, but I also have just rereading books I really liked. Or for example, the new V. Schwab book was coming out, so I reread the entire Shades of Magic trilogy. I reread Loveless. I reread Red, White and Royal Blue just because I like them. So combination of things, but yeah, I like rereading books. I'll probably do more this year, especially with my series focus, but we'll see how we go. I also haven't included in that manga rereads, which again may seem weird. I have some, so like I'm rereading all of I Hear the Sunspot at the moment to continue with the new volumes because I read it like 2 years ago. But I will often read a volume of manga when it comes out, and then when the next one's out 6 months later, I'll like read it again before reading the next one because they take me 40 minutes, and I don't tend to count those because to me it's almost like reading the new one. I don't know. Am I logical in this? No, but it makes sense in my head and it's my reading tracking, so It only needs to make sense to me. In terms of target audience age, I read 111 adult books, 10 YA, and 4 that I kind of classed as new adult. I realise it's a bit of an in-betweeny category, but there's some books that do just fit better in it. This tracks. I am moving more and more away from YA. I loved it. It makes me sad I'm moving away from it in some ways because I have this whole shelf of like queer YA books I really want to read because the stories sound great. But I'm just moving more and more towards adult literary fiction kind of stories as I get older, so not surprising at all. Given the person I am, I of course track, do I read queer books or not? So 77 of the books I read, which is 62% of my reading, the main character was queer. In 15 books I read, so 12%, there was LGBT characters present in the story as like relatively prominent characters. And then in 32 books, which is 26%, there was nobody queer, notably to me. I am sure there are moments in those books where there was a queer character like mentioned in passing, but if by the time I finish the book and go to put it in core pile, I can't call the character to mind that was absolutely, definitely queer, then I'm gonna claim it as absent because it doesn't really count at that point. And those will mainly be, I think, romances a lot, but also just some contemporary lit fiction. I mean, it can be a variety of things, obviously. But yes, 62% of my book, the main character is queer. Or a main character is queer. Which feels about right. I mean, one of the quickest ways to get me to pick up a book is to tell me that it has queer characters. So I'm, wholly predictable. As I've mentioned before, one of my goals for 2024 is to read more series. So an interesting statistic from 2023 is how many standalones versus series I was reading. So I read 52% of my reading was standalone books, which was 65 books, and 60 were series, so 48%. So it's actually relatively close. I don't have a good track of how many series I sort of started, continued, ended, because I have a few confusing things in that. One, as I said, I reread within year, so I will have technically started the series twice, but it's not starting another series. But when I track it on Corepile, it's the first book in a series. And then kind of similarly to that, I will read the most recently published book in a series, but it's not the last one. So that doesn't count as ending, obviously, but it is getting up to date. It's one of the biggest changes I've made to my tracker in 2024. It now includes a category for this is a reread of a series to mean I can continue, and also this is the most recently published book, even if not the end. So there's 5 categories instead of just start, middle, end. It's reread, start, middle, end, up to date, and that will be interesting to try and get some stats from next year. So my most surprising statistic is actually probably the publication year I was reading from. I mean, it's kind of logical in terms of my most books were read from 2023 and 2022, with 32 books, 26% from 2023, and 24 books, 19% from 2022. That makes sense. Recent releases, books I hadn't got to yet, books people are talking about a lot, makes a ton of sense. What surprises me is how spread it is over the kind of 5 years prior to that. So in 2021, 12 books, 2020, 17 books, 2019, 10 books, 2018, 7 books, 2017, 7 books, 2016, I think, was 6 books, and then back to about 2000 was the other 10, split out over 16 years. So the fact that those are all like so evenly spread almost kind of does surprise me. In some ways it doesn't, because I think a lot of that is manga. Having got into manga, I was reading a lot more backlist because I'm going back to the beginning of series that started a long time ago and have like 10 volumes out now. But yeah, it's a little bit of a weird one because I'm very used to like 80-90% of my reading having been within the last 2, maximum 3 years. So yeah, bit of a wider spread this year. And then in terms of authors I am reading from, 58 books I read are from new authors to me, so that's 46%, and 67 books that I read, so around 54%, are returning authors. So authors I have read from before and decided to go back to. And on that, I actually know that across this year I have read from 87 different authors, which across 125 books is pretty good. A lot of authors in there I've read 1 book from. And my most read authors, though, there were 5 kind of standouts, with having read 8 books from Natsuki Kizu, who wrote Given and Links, a manga series I have read basically all of this year. I read 6 books from TJ Klune, which was all of the Green Creek books and novellas, minus Wolf Song, because I read that the year before. I've read 6 books from Sachimo, another manga author that wrote the series Black or White, which I've read all of. I read 4 books from V.E. Schwab because I reread the 3 original Dark Shades of Magic books, and then also the newest one that came out this year, or last year now. And then I read 4 books from Tatsuya Endo, who wrote Spy Family, because I've started that series as well. So 3 manga series, 2 other big series. It makes sense. There's a few other people I've read 2 or 3 books from, but again, they get confusing because some of those include in-year rereads. And then my final statistic I have is just a little bit of information about those authors. This, I think like a lot of people, is not one I in any way, shape or form monitor and try and alter. It's just interesting. So I read 91 books written by women in this year, which was 73%. Not intentional, but I read a lot of romance and literary fiction, a lot of which is written by women, so it makes sense. I read 23 books written by men with 18.4%. I only read 7 books by non-binary people with 5.6%, and 4 books by multiple authors, so 3.2%. I'm surprised, well, not surprised, I'm saddened by the lack of non-binary on there. It is probably one I will go away and start trying to think about a little bit, of trying to track down some more non-binary authors. Being a non-binary person myself, I will fully admit that the second I see this non-binary character in a book, I buy it. Whether I get to them is a whole different issue because I'm a mood reader through and through. But yeah, if people know any really good non-binary authors and want to leave me recommendations, I would very much appreciate it because I want more. We want more. But I will also say, as is often the way with a lot of things, it's not always the easiest to tell. When you hear the blurb of a book, unless someone is specifically calling out the author, I'll fully admit I don't hear a blurb and go and research the author's gender before I pick it up. I just pick it up because the blurb sounds interesting. So it's not something I've actively looked for, but probably slightly more going into 2024. Okay, I'm aware that that took longer to get through all the stats than intended, so I am going to do the favourites in this video, but we're going to do it speedy. And that's probably a good thing, because I read a lot of these books many, many months ago and don't remember them very well, other than remembering I loved them. So we're going to get into that now. I do not have a coherent list of the top 10 books, and this is my number 1 favourite. That is not how my brain works at all. So we have some kind of categories of books and some books I really liked, and I'll talk about quite a few. I don't actually have the majority of them physically because I moved in December, and when I moved I took a lot of books I had read and sent them home with my parents, where they can be in my bedroom at home and not take up space in my new flat. So there's a lot of them I don't have with me, but we're gonna go through a lot of books I really liked in some different categories, and then we do have probably a list of 6 or 7 at the end, which are the ones that have really stuck in my mind as favourites. So first up is a couple of rereads, which I wanted to mention as just books I just love and had a fantastic time rereading. The first being The Time Traveller's Wife. I first read this when I first got back into reading when I was maybe 19 and loved it, and it instantly became a favourite book. And flash forward 6 years, I didn't believe myself. I was like, there's no way. You know, it was one of the first books I read. I'm sure it's not that good. No, it is. I love this book. The clue is in the title, The Time Traveller's Wife. This is about a man called Henry who time travels. He has no control over it. And it's a very, very interesting non-linear story about him basically repeatedly time traveling back to this young girl who later in life becomes his wife. So in some ways she's met him before he's met her, but she's grown up with him, and it's just fascinating and gorgeous, and I love it so much. And I'm so glad to have reread it because I adore it. And then the other reread was almost the opposite. It was a book I didn't like when I read it particularly and was convinced I was wrong in that I would like it. And that is This Is How You Lose the Time War. Love that these are both time travel books. Had not clocked that before now. This is an amazing little novella following 2 people who are on opposite sides of a time war, and they're basically fighting against each other to root history in different directions that their side wants to end up in a place they want. If you've seen Umbrella Academy, it's very much those vibes of change something in the past to make a big difference down the future. And I can't remember what it's called, the institution there that does that. Very much those vibes. I loved this. It is beautifully written. And I think the biggest thing I learned from the first time reading it, and what made all the difference this time, is it doesn't necessarily make all the sense. Like, it does, actually. I followed it really quite well, but if you go in looking for a really clean plot and a really clear understanding of exactly what's happening, you are not there for the right reasons, and you will probably not enjoy it that much. Versus if you're there for the vibes and the romance and everything else, you're gonna have a fantastic time. Second category we're gonna get into is romance. So this is an interesting one. I've spoken about this, I think, before, that I struggle with romance to often end up being like 5-star favorite reads, because something about like the weight of a romance doesn't hit the same as like a big fantasy or a big like deep literary fiction. And those are things I can really get my teeth into, but I just fucking love reading romance and it brings me great joy. So like enjoyment level is 5-star favorite. Sticking with me, often not. So that's why we're doing the whole romance category quickly, because some of these just need the shout out. I mean, all of them do. And we are starting off with the Icebreaker duology. I don't actually have Icebreaker with me, but I do have Wildfire. I say duology. It's not a duology. It's just the only 2 books are out right now. I'm chatting shit. But Icebreaker and Wildfire. Icebreaker is currently with my friend Emma, who is reading it and has been reading it since September, but hopefully she'll finish it at some point. These are just fantastic romance books. I know not everyone loves them, but to me, they are some of the best romance books I've ever read. The first one is following Anastasia and Nate, who one is an ice skater, one is an ice hockey player. Something happens, they have to share an ice rink. They end up actually figure skating together. It's great. To me, it is healthy characters who are like going to therapy and getting their lives together, and a bit of a step up retelling mixed in there for anyone else that's obsessed with that movie. And honestly, I just freaking loved it. And one of my favorite things about Hannah Grace is she doesn't really do third act breakups. There will be conflict, there will be conversation, and they will work through it together instead of getting mad at each other for no good reason. And we love it. Wildfire, different concept, different tropes. One night stand that they end up having to spend loads of time together after, and miscommunication, but done really, really well, because I hate miscommunication, but it's top. I just love them. I know they're not everyone's cup of tea. They are fluffy, fun romances, but they hit on a lot of deeper topics, and I personally think they are fantastic. Next for me was 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. Ooh, this is like a harder hitting romance with a lot of other themes. There's chronic illness in this, lots of themes about coming from like, honestly, a very different socioeconomic background than you see in a lot of books, especially romance books, where everything has to be like nice and fun and everyone's got all the money to spend. And you've got like, single parents and just lots of things. Fantastic. It follows 2 authors that had some form of relationship when they were teenagers and are reconnecting later in life. It is so beautiful, and I cannot wait to read more from Tia Williams in the future. Next is Vicky Romeo plus Jules by Ellie Percy. I think I mentioned this in the vlog earlier, well, last year. And this is a really, really interesting book. So this is a book set in around 2000, 2001 in Scotland, in the queer scene in Glasgow. And you're following a relatively masculine-presenting lesbian and a femme-presenting person. And basically it is just the story of their romance. But it's a very, very interesting look at what the queer scene was 20 odd years ago. And I mentioned this when I read it. The book came out in around 2016, 2017, I think, but was written in 2000, 2001, where it's set. And the author made the decision when the book was finally picked up by a publisher and released to not kind of update it to reflect the queer scene in 2016, but to reflect it in 2001. So there is language in this, there are views in this that are very, very outdated, and the author's very open about that. There's a note at the front of the book. But that's kind of the point. It's a true picture of a point in history, and it's just really, really fascinating to see how far we've come in that time. It's a brilliant book. I didn't expect to love it quite as much as I did. It has a big theatre aspect as well, which of course I'm always going to love, and people, you know, figuring out their identity and this and that. It's great. Next up, one I do actually have with me is A Shot in the Dark by Victoria Lee. Anyone that's watched me for a while will know that I absolutely adore Victoria Lee. The Fever King duology is one of my favourite duologies of all time. So Victoria Lee writing a romance book with a trans main character, and just, come on, I knew I was gonna love it. This follows Ellie and Wyatt. Ellie is a up-and-coming like photography student, Wyatt is a photographer, Ellie moves back to New York, having not lived there in years, has a one-night stand, great times, and then discovers her photography professor is that person. All gets a bit interesting, and there's just a load of talk about relationships with family from the aspect of being queer and being trans, and how religion plays into that really deeply. And it was just beautifully written. There's a big focus on addiction in here as well. Just, I cannot recommend it enough. Genuinely, this moved me. It was so hard-hitting but left on such a hopeful feeling. I just thoroughly love this book, and I don't feel like I've seen people talking about it, and I need everyone to read this. It is fantastic. And then my final favourite in the romance category is My Own Worst Enemy by Lily Linden. I read Double Booked by Lily Linden a couple of years ago and was hotly anticipating her next release, and this is it. This follows two butch theatre gays. They are going for like the same acting jobs and they're typecast the same, and it's a really interesting look on being butch in the queer scene and being attracted to other people that look like you versus, you know, what you see in all of media, which is a butch with a femme, and because it then basically still follows the man-woman vibes ridiculousness. Just, I love Lily Linden. Her characters are pure fucking chaos. None of them have an iota of a brain cell of sense, and it's great, and I relate far too highly to them, and I love every second of reading them. So My Own Worst Enemy by Lily Linden. I'm not going to say this for everyone because I made a load of people read Double Booked and they all absolutely didn't like the main character, whereas I felt I was the main character. So take it as you will. I'm not sure this is for everyone, but if you want chaotic queers in the theatre scene, then this might be the one for you. Okay, on to the second category. We're going to be talking about fantasy and sci-fi for a minute. I've only got a few books in this category, which is surprising, but I do. To be fair, some others that would fall into this are in my like favourites list. We'll get to it in a second. But the first is The Deep Sky by Yume Kitase. I love this book. I had such a good reading run. I read like 4 of these books basically in a row in like September, and oh, it was just a good time. The Deep Sky. This is a sci-fi dystopian thriller following a world in which we have sent off 90 odd people into space to go like live elsewhere and repopulate the world at the other end. Great stuff. Someone on that ship dies. And then you get into this whole investigation of what happened and who can you trust, who can you not. And then you're also flashing back to Earth where you're seeing people training and trying to get onto this mission in the first place. And it just is so good and so beautifully written, and it's queer, and I don't even know how to describe it, but I loved every second of reading this and was completely gripped. Another one I don't have with me is, I'm just doing the entire thing at this point, the entire Green Creek series by TJ Klune. 4 main books: Wolf Song, Raven Song, Heart Song, Brother Song, and then there's a few novellas as well, like Feral Song and Love Song, I think. I read basically all of them this year. I'd read Wolf Song before, so I started with Raven Song, and I genuinely just think this series is fantastic. I think the characters are incredibly well developed. I cried so many times reading Brother Song, which is the final book. I honestly just loved it. I know there's some things people find a bit questionable, and like, yeah, sure, there probably are, but I think overall the relationships and the found family and the messiness of a family come across so well in this, and I loved it completely. Queer werewolves, what else can I say? And then one other thing in the fantasy category is The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow. This is a little novella Alex wrote as part of like an Amazon Prime series, I think. And I think it's less than 100 pages. It's short, but it is fantastic. And basically is this slightly weird, partially written in second person story of someone being reincarnated repeatedly. I won't say more than that. It is so good. If you have an hour, sit and read it. If you've got Amazon Prime, it's free. I can't say more than that because it's only 100 pages, but read it. Okay, and now we're gonna get into my kind of top 7-ish books of the year. These aren't in any particular order because I don't know what order I would put them in. These are just 7 books I really, really loved that I read throughout the year. The first being True Biz. This is a book following a deaf school, basically, and you're following 3 different characters. One is a hearing character who grew up in a deaf family. One is a deaf character that grew up in a hearing family, and one is a deaf character that grew up in a deaf family. And students, teachers, very interesting, lots of politics, lots of information about what it's like to be in the deaf community from different standpoints. There's a bit of a kind of thrillery plot element going in as well, which kind of going to ignore because the ending of that didn't really work, but everything about this book was amazing other than that. And I just find it completely fascinating, gorgeously written. If you have any interest, or even if you don't, honestly, in learning more about the deaf community or understanding more about what those people's lives are like, it's set in America, so it's slightly specific to that, but nonetheless, I'm sure some parts are relatable. Read it. It's the perfect level of a fantastic, gripping story with amazing characters, and also very educational if that's the way you like to get your information. Next up is Lonely Castle in the Mirror. I read this on Alison Page's recommendation, and it's not a book I would have ever picked up. I have seen it around loads of times, it's everywhere, and never once have I considered it. And then something about how Alison described it, I was like, oh, I want to read that. I want to read that. Went and bought it, read it like the next week, and it's made the top books of the year list. I loved this. This follows a group of children who all for various reasons like aren't attending school, and their mirrors glow and they get brought into this castle and basically have a mission that will give them something if they succeed. And it's over the span of a year, follows like the friendships forming, the rivalries, their own personal struggles. It is just... My camera cut me off, but we're back. This just took me completely by surprise. I didn't expect to love it. It's heartbreaking, it's beautiful. The writing was much more lyrical than I expected. I often find in translated work, especially translated from Japanese, that the writing isn't my kind of style. I loved this, recommend. I don't know what else I was going to say because the camera cut me off, but it's great. Next up is Mrs. S. Oh, I loved this book. Interestingly, when I read this, I rated it a 4-star, and then when I was going back through all the books I've read this year to list favourites, I just had to include it. So I think that means it's going to need to be upped to a 5-star, if we're honest. But this follows a kind of mask-presenting main character who is working at, I think, a private all-girls school, has come over from Australia to work in the UK, and basically feels very lonely, doesn't really feel they have a community, and feels like the girls are kind of taking the piss, and working as a teacher ends up getting into a relationship with the headmaster's wife. It's very interesting, lots of discussions on gender and sexuality and fitting in, and it's written by a non-binary author, and just gorgeous, amazing, hit really hard, weirdly written, kind of not creepy vibes, but like unsettling at times. It's so good. Next is probably the least surprising book on this list, which is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Another Alex E. Harrow making my favourites list. Every Alex E. Harrow book I've ever read making a favourites list. Wow, who could have called it? This is Starling House. This is my Illumicrate edition, which I'm just noticing has got scratched, probably in the move, sad times. Anyway, very shiny. This follows a main character who, kind of having a bit of a hard time, is obsessed with this author and this house the author used to live in, and somehow gets drawn in and ends up working there. And then mythical, gothic-y stuff starts happening. I've seen people saying it's not fantasy enough, it's not gothic enough, it's not whatever enough. To me, it was perfect. I loved this. I got so into it. I love Alex E. Harrow's writing, obviously. I mean, I've loved everything she's ever written. I don't really have anything else to say. This, for me, was freaking fantastic. Another one I don't have with me is Natural Beauty. This was very unexpected. I 100% picked this up as a cover buy, saw it in Forbidden Planet. It was floppy, it looked kind of interesting, it had mention of music on the back, I got it. Did I know it was classed as a horror? No. Would I have got it if I did? Probably not, so glad I didn't know that. But this is a really interesting book following someone who grew up as kind of a music prodigy, and their family really encouraged that, and then something happened that they stopped playing music and they get a job at a beauty store. And slightly just odd things start happening. And is it actually happening? Are they imagining it? Do we know? Lots of commentary on beauty standards and autonomy and like abuse of power. It was just really, really good and really, really interesting, and not at all what I expected it to be. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Please look at trigger warnings, especially around like sexual abuse. I do not think, given the blurb and how people talk about this book, that is where you would expect it to go at all. I certainly didn't. Luckily for me, that kind of doesn't matter, but please go in carefully if it could be a risk for you, because there are some relatively graphic scenes that were uncomfortable for anyone to read, but could be damaging to some people, I believe. So just go a bit carefully, but if it sounds like that's something you'd be okay with, absolutely give this one a go. The penultimate book I have to talk about is actually a graphic novel, and it is the last book I read of the year, and that is Ballad for Sophie. This is a really chunky graphic novel with the most stunning art style. Let me find a picture that shows it well. Like, you can just see the really almost like harsh, not what's the word I'm looking for, geometric style. I love it. And this follows, very a la Evelyn Hugo, this follows a journalist going to this reclusive musician to try and work out basically where he went and what happened. And it tells his life story, and there's more things going on, and just the love of music and so many other things. This was so good. So good. And then finally, the last book I'm going to talk about, and if we're honest, the one I would probably class as like my top book of the year, Open Water. Another super shiny one, so I'm going to need to be a bit careful. I love this book. I need to read it again, to be honest. This follows two characters in basically a kind of on again, off again, will they, won't they relationship, with a massive focus on music and dance and what that can mean to a person. And that's basically it. And I just loved the really, really, really honest portrayal of people being scared to lose what they have to pursue something else, and whether you should or whether you shouldn't. And just, this hit for me in all the reasons, and I loved it. It's beautifully written. It is tiny, and yeah, it has held its spot as my favorite thing I read this year. I don't want to say too much because I went in quite blind, and I kind of think that's the best way to do it. But fucking fantastic book, and I will be reading it again. No, I'm scared to read it again because what if I don't like it as much, or if it doesn't hold up, you know, all of that. But oh, it hit in a way I could never have expected, and I will be reading more for this author once I am, again, no longer scared that I'm not going to like it as much. So that's it. That's everything I read. That's my favourite books. I had a damn good reading year overall. It was very up and down, which kind of given how the year went isn't surprising, and honestly it's just kind of what I'm like. So I'm very happy with how much I read, what I read, etc. Let me know down below how your reading went this year. I'm loving watching everyone's like stats videos and favourites videos. It's one of the best times of year for content, honestly. And if you have any books like based on those favourites that you think I would like, please let me know. Let me know your favourites. We love this time of year for all the book love. But that is it for this one. I have no idea what I'm filming next, but I'll see you in the next one, whenever that is. So bye, see you soon.